So what really happens in the brain at the moment we die? For most of human history, that was a question for priests and philosophers. But now, for the first time, neuroscientists are actually capturing data from this final frontier. And what they're seeing, well, it's not at all what we expected. It's actually forcing this incredible conversation between brand new science and some very, very old wisdom.
Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First up, we'll dive into a real scientific puzzle that's turning a lot of old ideas on their head. Then, we're going to look at a completely different kind of map of dying, one that comes from Tibetan Buddhism. We'll explore where these two, very different worlds might overlap, and just as importantly, where they don't. And we'll wrap up by getting into some of the really tough, really urgent ethical questions that all of this brings up.
All right, let's jump right in with the science, because a recent discovery has really shaken up our whole understanding of the brain's final moments.
For the longest time, when you asked what happens in the brain when we die, science had a pretty straightforward answer, and it was all based on one really simple assumption. And that assumption was, basically, nothing happens. The conventional wisdom was that, as the heart stops, the oxygen stops flowing, the brain just powers down. It gets quiet, it goes inert. Kind of like a light on a dimmer switch, just slowly fading to black.
But then, a study in 2023 came along and just threw a wrench in all of that. See, researchers were looking at the brain activity, the EEG, of 4 comatose patients right after life support was withdrawn. And in 2 of them, they saw something absolutely wild. Instead of that quiet fade-out everyone expected, they recorded this massive, organized surge of activity.
And look, this wasn't just like static or random noise. No, this was highly structured activity. We're talking a huge surge in gamma waves, and those are the fastest brain waves we have, the ones associated with complex stuff like conscious thought, memory, and intense focus. And get this, it was all happening in a part of the brain called the posterior hot zone, which is, well, exactly what it sounds like, a key area for conscious experience. The 2 halves of the brain were even talking to each other more. So it turns out, the dying brain might not be so quiet after all.
Okay, now we have to pump the brakes here for a second, because this is super important. The researchers themselves are really clear about the limitations. First off, this surge was only seen in 2 of the 4 patients. And both of those patients had a history of seizures, which could be a factor. Plus, because the patients didn't survive, we have absolutely no way of knowing if this brain activity corresponded to any kind of subjective experience. So it's a really fascinating clue for sure, but it is not, I repeat, not a conclusion.
Okay, so now that we have this scientific puzzle on the table, I want to completely shift gears. Let's leave the world of modern EEG scans and travel back in time to look at a very different kind of map of the dying process. This one was developed over centuries by Tibetan Buddhist contemplatives, based on meditation and really close observation of people at the end of life.
So, this ancient tradition describes the dying process as a sequence of 8 dissolutions. The first 4 are called the gross dissolutions, and what's so interesting is that they link an outer physical sign with a specific inner subjective sign. So as the body's earth element dissolves and a person feels weak and heavy, the inner sign is said to be like seeing a mirage. As the water element dissolves and bodily fluids dry up, the inner sign is seeing smoke. Then as the fire element and body warmth fade, it's like seeing sparks or fireflies. And finally, as the wind element goes and the breath stops, the inner experience is described as watching a sputtering butter lamp flame about to go out.
But here's where it gets even more radical. It doesn't stop when the breath stops. The tradition then describes 4 more dissolutions, called the subtle ones. And these are all purely internal experiences. They report a sequence of appearances, a vacuity filled with white light, then red light, then a deep darkness, all leading to what's described as a final state of incredibly clear, pure awareness, what they call the clear light.
Now, this is precisely why these texts are so fascinating for our conversation. You don't have to buy into any of the metaphysics or religious beliefs behind it. What you have here is a remarkably specific, detailed phenomenological report. It's basically a step-by-step claim about the subjective experience of dying, developed over hundreds of years. It's a taxonomy of inner experience that we can actually examine.
All right, so now we've got these 2 very different accounts on the table, right? The cutting-edge neuroscience and this ancient contemplative map. So let's put them into conversation. Let's see where they might, rhyme.
This is where it gets really intriguing. On the one hand, modern neuroscience finds a mysterious surge of activity right in the brain's consciousness hot zone. On the other hand, the ancient tradition reports a whole sequence of vivid internal visual phenomena. The science raises the question, could there be hidden brain activity after everything seems to shut down?
And the contemplative claim is, essentially, yes, lucidity can absolutely persist even after the outer signs of life, like breathing, have stopped.
And here's maybe the most specific point of connection. Remember that hot zone where the gamma surge was detected? Well, the neuroscientists who wrote the study point out that this exact same area is known to be involved in things like dreaming, visual hallucinations, and even out-of-body experiences. So you have to ask, could the reports of fireflies and a sputtering flame from these ancient texts be the subjective first-person experience of that very neural event? It's a pretty tantalizing thought, isn't it? And it's not just ancient reports. We have modern ones, too. Take Matthew Melton, for example. He had a near-death experience, and, with no prior religious framework to draw on, he described this incredibly vivid sensation of being blasted through what felt like a tube or a wormhole.
But again, we have to be really, really careful here. Matthew's account is powerful, but it's just one person's story. It's an anecdote. It's a memory, reconstructed after the event, shaped by culture and language. It's not generalizable evidence.
So, this all sounds pretty cool. But we also have to be honest about where this whole analogy just breaks down. It's absolutely crucial to acknowledge the limits of this comparison.
Okay, let's get real for a minute. First, a neural correlate is not the experience itself. Seeing a blip on an EEG is not the same thing as seeing fireflies. Second, a gamma surge in 2 out of 4 patients, both with seizure histories, is a long way from being a universal signature of dying. Third, the dissolution sequence is a model from a specific contemplative tradition. It's not an empirical average of what happens to everyone. And of course, survivor testimonies are memories, not live feeds. And we can't forget the simplest alternative hypothesis. Maybe all these strange experiences are just the brain's way of freaking out when it's starved of oxygen.
And all of this, all this data, all these stories, it leads us to our final and I think most important section. Because what we're left with isn't a neat answer. We're left with profound uncertainty. And that uncertainty raises some really tough, really practical questions that we have to face.
Just think about this for a second. If there is even a chance that the dying brain can have this kind of covert activity, what does that mean for our protocols at the bedside? How should that affect the process of withdrawing life support? Or what about organ procurement, where the timing of circulatory death is absolutely critical?
And what about the person themselves? What do we owe them in their final hours? If there's a possibility of some kind of internal experience going on, does that change how we think about things like analgesia, about the noise level in the room, about whether someone is there, holding their hand, speaking to them?
And can you imagine being the doctor or the nurse in that situation, trying to communicate with a family at the bedside? How do you navigate that conversation, offering both honesty about the uncertainty and compassion in a moment of incredible grief? There are just no simple answers here.
Ultimately, we aren't left with answers. We're left with a question, a really profound one. In the face of this deep uncertainty, what might we owe to the dying? What does it truly mean to care for someone in their final moments? That's the challenge that this new science and this ancient wisdom really leaves for all of us to think about.